5 years earlier, before the dust had settled into the cracks of Red Hollow the way it had now, Elias Carter was not standing in the town square, but riding alone along the narrow stretch of creek that cut through the northern edge of the valley, a place where the cottonwoods grew thin and the water moved slow and dark, like it was carrying secrets it refused to give up. And the evening had come down heavy that day, the kind of sky that pressed low and turned everything the color of worn iron. And he had not meant to stop, not meant to notice anything at all, because men like Elias learned early that seeing less meant carrying less. But then there had been a sound, not loud, not desperate, just wrong in a way that made his horse shift beneath him. And when he turned, he saw her standing there at the edge of the water, Clara Whitmore, though she had not yet been that name to him, her dress darkened by the damp air, her posture too still for someone alone in that kind of place. And there had been something else, something in the way she held her hands, not raised, not hidden, just suspended like she had forgotten what they were supposed to do next. And Elias had dismounted without thinking, his boots sinking slightly into the soft ground as he approached, slow, careful, the way you approach a situation that has already decided how it will end. And when she turned to face him, her eyes did not carry fear the way most would. They carried calculation, the kind that measures a man in a single glance and decides whether he is worth speaking to at all. And for a long moment neither of them said anything. The only sound the quiet movement of the creek and the distant rumble of thunder rolling somewhere beyond the hills. And then she spoke, not loudly, not urgently, but with a calm that felt heavier than panic ever could be. She said that he should leave, that whatever he thought he saw was not his concern. And Elias had looked past her then, just enough to understand that something had already happened here that could not be undone, something the town would not understand and would not forgive. And he felt that familiar weight settle into his chest, the one that came when a man realized he was standing at the edge of a choice that would follow him longer than he intended to live. And he could have turned away, could have mounted his horse and ridden back toward the open land where things stayed simple and quiet. But instead he stayed, because there was something in her voice that did not ask for help and did not expect it either. And that made the decision for him in a way nothing else could have. And when she finally looked at him, again, really looked this time, she did not explain, she did not defend herself. She only said one thing, slow and certain, that some truths do not save anyone. And Elias Carter, who had spent most of his life believing that truth was the only thing that mattered, found himself nodding like he understood something he had never been taught. And without another word, he stepped forward into a story that had already begun long before he arrived, a story that would ask him to carry silence the way other men carried guns, steady, unseen, and always within reach. The rain came not long after she spoke, a steady, cold fall that blurred the edges of everything and turned the creek into a dark ribbon that moved with quiet insistence. And Elias Carter stood there for a moment longer than he should have, feeling the weight of her words settle into him like something permanent, something that would not wash away no matter how hard the sky tried. And Clara Whitmore did not step back or move to leave. She simply watched him as if measuring whether he would do what most men did, walk away and pretend none of it had ever existed. But Elias did not move, not yet, because there are moments in a man's life when silence is not absence but decision, and he was making one now without saying it out loud. And finally, he turned his head slightly, not enough to stare, just enough to acknowledge what lay behind her without naming it. And that was when she shifted for the first time, a small movement, almost reluctant, as if she understood that whatever happened next would bind them in a way neither of them had asked for. And she said that if he stayed, then he would have to carry it, not part of it, not the version that made sense, but all of it, the part no one would believe and the part no one would want to hear. And Elias answered the only way he knew how, with a quiet nod and a breath that felt heavier than the air around him. And together, without ceremony, without agreement spoken aloud, they stepped into the work of it, the kind of work that leaves no mark on the surface but changes everything underneath. And the hours that followed moved slowly, marked not by words but by small actions, deliberate, careful, each one done with the understanding that once finished there would be no returning to what had been before. And when it was over, when the ground lay smooth again and the rain had softened every edge, Clara stood a few feet away from him, her hands clean now, her posture steadier, And for the first time, there was something like exhaustion in her eyes. Not fear, not regret. Just the weight of having done what could not be undone. And she looked at him, then not as a stranger, but as someone who now carried a part of her life whether he wanted it or not. And she asked him why he had not left, why he had chosen to stay when nothing required him to. And Elias thought about it longer than the question deserved, because the truth was not simple and not something he had ever put into words. And finally he said that sometimes leaving does not make a man free. Sometimes it just makes him empty. And she held his gaze for a moment, searching for something in it, perhaps doubt, perhaps judgment, but finding neither. And then she gave a small nod, the kind that closes a door without making a sound, and turned away from the creek, walking back toward the direction of town with a steady pace that did not invite him to follow. And Elias watched her go until the rain swallowed her shape entirely, and only then did he return to his horse, his movements slower now, heavier, as if something unseen had been placed across his shoulders. And as he rode back through the dim light, the world looked the same as it had that morning, the same fences, the same distant hills, the same quiet stretch of land that asked nothing from anyone. But inside him something had shifted, something that would not settle no matter how many miles he put between himself and that creek. Because from that night on, Elias Carter did not just carry his own past, he carried hers as well, and the silence between them, unspoken and absolute, became the one thing in Red Hollow that neither time nor distance could ever truly bury. The next morning arrived without ceremony, the kind of pale light that crept slowly over the land as if unsure it belonged there. And Red Hollow woke the way it always did, with the low creak of wooden signs, the distant clatter of tools, and the quiet rhythm of lives that preferred routine over questions. And Elias Carter moved through it like he always had, unnoticed unless someone chose to look too closely, which most did not, because there was something about him that discouraged curiosity. Something in the way he kept his gaze forward and his words to a minimum, and by the time the sun had climbed high enough to warm the dust along the main road, he had already finished his work at the edge of town and was heading back toward his small stretch of land, a place just far enough away to feel separate but close enough to hear the faint echo of voices when the wind carried them right. And for a while, everything held steady, the silence between him and Clara unbroken, untested, existing like a line drawn in the sand that no one else could see. But that began to change not with a shout or a sudden event, but with something smaller, quieter, the kind of shift that only becomes clear when it is already too late to stop. And it started with the absence of a name, because in a town like Red Hollow, people noticed when something disappeared, even if they pretended not to care. And by the third day, the conversations had begun, low and careful at first, spoken over coffee or between tasks, questions about a man who had not been seen since the last storm, a man who had no family in town and few friends worth mentioning, the kind of man who could vanish without leaving much behind except a vague sense that something had been misplaced, and the sheriff. A man who believed in order more than truth, made a few quiet inquiries, nothing official, nothing that would stir trouble, just enough to satisfy the expectation that something was being done. And Elias heard about it the same way everyone else did, not directly, but through fragments, through a pause in conversation when he walked by, through a glance that lingered half a second too long. And he understood then that the silence he had chosen was not empty. It was active. It was shaping the story whether he spoke or not. And later that afternoon, as he worked along the fence line that marked the edge of his property, he saw her again, Clara Whitmore, riding into town with the same steady posture she always carried, her expression unchanged, her presence as composed as if nothing in the world had shifted beneath her feet. And for a brief moment their eyes met across the distance, not long enough for anyone else to notice, but long enough for something unspoken to pass between them. A recognition not of guilt or fear, but of shared knowledge, the kind that does not need words to exist. And she did not slow, did not turn, simply continued into town as though she belonged exactly where she was. And Elias watched until she disappeared behind the line of buildings. And then he returned to his work, his hands moving with practiced rhythm, but his mind no longer quiet, because he understood now that what they had buried had not ended anything. It had only begun something slower, something that would stretch across days and months and years. And the real weight of it would not come from what had happened that night by the creek, but from what followed, from the choice to say nothing while the world around them built its own version of the truth. And from that moment on, every sunrise in Red Hollow carried a question that no one could quite form, and every sunset carried the answer that Elias Carter refused to give. Time did not erase what had been buried. It only taught it how to sit quietly beneath everything else. And over the months that followed, Red Hollow returned to its reversionary rhythm, the same wagons rolling through every morning, the same voices rising and falling along the wooden sidewalks, the same quiet assumptions that allowed people to believe they understood the world they lived in. And Elias Carter became part of that rhythm again, or at least he appeared to. His days measured in fence posts and cattle tracks, his nights spent beneath a sky that never asked questions. And yet there was something different in the way he moved, something slower, more deliberate, as if every step carried weight no one else could see. And sometimes, when the wind shifted just right, he would find himself looking toward the creek, without meaning to, as if some part of him had never truly left that place. And Clara Whitmore, for her part, became something the town could admire without effort, her presence steady, her words measured, her reputation growing not from what she said, but from what she did not. Because in a place like Red Hollow, a person who kept their composure was often mistaken for someone without secrets. And the years began to stack one on top of another, quiet and uneventful on the surface, but beneath it all, the silence between them grew roots, deep and tangled, threading itself into every passing day. And there were moments, small and easily missed, when that silence almost broke, like the afternoon Elias found himself standing at the edge of the general store as Clara stepped out, the two of them pausing just long enough for their eyes to meet. And in that brief exchange there was a question that neither of them asked out loud, a question about whether the past could remain where it had been placed, or whether it would one day rise in a way neither of them could control. And Elias felt it then, the pressure of time not as something distant, but as something closing in, slow and patient. And he wondered, not for the first time, whether silence was something a man chose once or something he had to choose again every single day. And as the seasons turned, bringing heat that cracked the earth and cold that stiffened it again, that question stayed with him, settling deeper with each passing year, until it no longer felt like a question at all, but a quiet understanding that whatever had been buried had not disappeared. It had simply been waiting. And on a night 5 years after that rain by the creek, when the town gathered under lantern light, and the air carried the weight of something about to change, Elias Carter stood at the edge of that understanding and realized that silence, no matter how carefully carried, always comes to a point where it can no longer hold. And when that moment arrives, it does not ask permission. It simply waits for a man to decide whether he will keep carrying it or finally set it down. The shift did not arrive with thunder or raised voices. It came the way truth often does in places like Red Hollow, quiet, patient, wearing the face of a stranger who did not belong to anyone, and therefore belonged to everyone's attention. And he rode in just past noon on a dry afternoon, when the sun hung high and unforgiving, his horse steady, his posture straight in a way that suggested purpose rather than travel. And people noticed him the same way they noticed everything else, with quick glances that turned into longer ones when they thought no one was watching. And he did not smile, did not greet anyone, simply dismounted near the water trough, and took his time as if he had already decided he would not be leaving soon. And Elias Carter saw him from across the street, not because he was looking for him, but because men like Elias learned to recognize when something entered their world that did not follow its usual rules. And there was something about this man that did not fit. Not in the way he moved, not in the way he looked at the buildings as if measuring them against something unseen, and certainly not in the way his eyes paused, just for a moment, on the direction of the creek beyond town. And that was enough for Elias to understand that whatever had been waiting all these years had finally found its way back. And the man introduced himself later that afternoon, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet statement made inside the general store where voices carried less and words seemed to settle heavier. He said his name was Daniel Whitmore, and that he was looking for answers about his brother, a man who had passed through Red Hollow years ago and never returned. And the name alone was enough to change the air in the room, subtle but real, like a door closing somewhere out of sight. And Elias did not move, did not react, But inside something tightened, something that had been still for too long suddenly remembering how to move. And Daniel did not accuse, did not demand. He simply asked questions the way a man asks when he already expects silence in return, and the townspeople gave him what they had: fragments, half-memories, guesses dressed as facts. None of it enough to satisfy someone who had come this far for something real. And as the sun dipped lower and the shadows stretched longer across the street, Daniel stepped outside and stood there for a long moment, his gaze drifting across the town until it landed, inevitably, on Elias Carter. And in that moment, without a word spoken between them, something passed, not recognition exactly, but awareness, the kind that tells a man he has found the place where his questions might finally meet their answer. And Elias held that gaze without flinching, because looking away would have meant something he was not ready to admit. And the distance between them, no more than 30 feet of dry ground and scattered footprints, felt heavier than any miles Elias had ever ridden. And for the first time in 5 years, the silence he had carried no longer felt like something contained. It felt like something that was about to be tested. And as the evening settled in and lanterns flickered to life one by one, casting a soft glow over a town that believed it understood itself, Elias Carter realized that the moment he had been holding back all this time had not passed. It had been waiting, and now it was standing right in front of him, wearing a stranger's face and asking a question he could no longer ignore. Daniel Whitmore did not rush, and that was the first thing Elias Carter understood about him, because men who rushed were often chasing something they feared losing. But Daniel moved like a man who believed time would eventually bend in his direction, like someone who knew that answers had a way of surfacing if you stood still long enough. And over the next few days, he did exactly that, lingering where people gathered, asking questions that sounded simple but carried weight beneath them. Questions about weather from 5 years ago, about who had been in town and who had left, about small details that most would have forgotten if not for the way he listened when they spoke. And Elias watched it all from a distance, not interfering, not avoiding, simply observing the slow way pressure was being applied to something that had held for too long. And it became clear that Daniel was not looking for a story. He was looking for a fracture, a place where the truth had not been set quite right, and the town, without meaning to, began to give him pieces. A mention of the storm that had flooded the creek, a memory of a man passing through with no clear destination, a gap in time that no one could quite explain, and none of it pointed directly to anything. But all of it circled closer, tightening in a way that could not be undone once it began. And Clara Whitmore remained exactly as she had always been, composed, distant in the way that invited respect rather than suspicion. But there was a subtle shift in her presence now, something in the way she paused a fraction longer when someone mentioned the past, something in the way her eyes seemed to weigh every word spoken around her, as if measuring which ones might matter later. And Elias noticed it because he knew what to look for. He knew the difference between someone who had nothing to hide and someone who had learned how to carry it well. And one evening, as the sun lowered behind the ridge and the town settled into that quiet hour between work and night, Daniel approached him without hesitation, crossing the same stretch of ground that had once separated them, his steps unhurried, his expression steady. And when he stopped a few feet away, he did not introduce himself again, did not repeat what had already been said. He simply looked at Elias and asked if he had been here 5 years ago when the storm came through. And the question hung there, simple on the surface but carrying everything beneath it. And Elias did not answer right away, not because he did not know what to say, but because he understood that whatever he chose now would not remain small. It would move, it would grow, it would reach places he could not control. And Daniel did not press, did not fill the silence. He just waited, the way he had waited for everything else. And in that stillness, Elias felt the weight of every quiet day that had come before, every moment he had chosen not to speak. And for the first time, it did not feel like something contained within him. It felt like something standing between him and the world, something that had taken shape over time and now demanded to be acknowledged. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, the same as it had always been. But there was a difference beneath it, something that could not be heard but could be felt, because he was no longer answering just a man. He was answering the moment that had been waiting for 5 years to arrive. The answer Elias Carter gave was not long, not detailed, just a quiet acknowledgement that he had been there when the storm came through, that he had seen the creek rise and the sky break open in a way that made the land feel smaller than it was. And Daniel Whitmore listened without interrupting, his expression unchanged, but his eyes sharpened slightly, like a man who had just confirmed something he already suspected. And he asked another question, just as simple, asking if Elias had seen anyone else near the creek that night. And again the space between them held more than the words themselves, because Elias knew that every answer now was not just information, it was direction. It was a path being laid one step at a time towards something that could not be undone once reached. And he chose his words carefully, saying that storms had a way of keeping people close to shelter, that most would not risk the creek when it ran like that. And Daniel nodded slowly, as if the answer had not surprised him, as if it had only narrowed the shape of what he was already building in his mind. And then he thanked Elias in a tone that carried more weight than politeness required, and stepped back, leaving the conversation exactly where it stood, unfinished but no longer uncertain. And over the next few days, that same pattern repeated itself, Daniel asking, listening, never pushing too hard, never revealing too much, but always moving forward in a way that felt inevitable, and the town began to feel it, not as fear, but as a kind of quiet unease that settled into conversations and lingered after they ended, because people sensed that something was being uncovered even if they did not know what it was. And Clara Whitmore felt it as well, though she showed less than anyone, her movements still measured, her voice still calm. But there were moments when her attention would drift, just slightly, toward the direction of Elias, as if confirming that the line they had drawn years ago still held. And one evening, as the light faded and the first stars began to appear above the ridge, she approached him without hesitation, finding him near the edge of town where the noise faded into open land. And for a moment they stood without speaking, the silence between them familiar, almost steady, until she finally asked him if he had spoken to Daniel, her voice even, but carrying something beneath it that had not been there before. And Elias answered that he had, and she nodded once, as if that alone told her everything she needed to know. And then she asked the question that had been waiting beneath everything else, not about Daniel, not about the town, but about him, asking whether he intended to keep carrying it the way he always had. And Elias did not answer right away, because for the first time in 5 years, the answer was no longer something he could give without hesitation. And in that pause, Clara understood more than any words could have explained, and she looked at him with a steady gaze, not pleading, not demanding, but acknowledging that whatever came next would not belong to either of them alone. And then she said something quiet, something that settled deeper than anything else had. She said that silence can protect a person, but it can also protect the wrong things. And when she turned and walked away, leaving him there beneath a sky that offered no guidance, Elias Carter felt the weight of those words settle into him, heavier than the silence he had carried for 5 years. And for the first time, he began to wonder not whether he could keep the secret, but whether he should. That night did not bring rest. It brought stillness, the kind that presses against a man until he begins to hear things he has spent years trying to ignore. And Elias Carter sat alone on the edge of his porch, the lantern beside him burning low, casting a soft circle of light that did not reach far enough to touch the darkness beyond. And he found himself thinking not about what had happened 5 years ago, but about everything that had followed, the quiet days, the passing seasons, the way silence had shaped his life without ever asking permission. And for the first time, he began to see it differently, not as something he had carried out of strength, but as something that had slowly taken something from him in return, something he had not noticed until now. And the words Clara had spoken earlier lingered in his mind, not loud, not demanding, just present in a way that could not be dismissed. And he realized that silence had never been neutral. It had always chosen a side, even when he believed it had not. And sometime before dawn, when the sky was still dark but no longer night, he stood and stepped off the porch, not with urgency, but with a kind of quiet certainty that had been building for longer than he had understood. And by the time the first light touched the horizon, he was already walking toward town, his pace steady, his expression unchanged, but something within him no longer holding back the way it had before. And Red Hollow woke slowly as it always did, unaware that this morning would not pass the way others had. and Elias moved through it without drawing attention, passing familiar faces who nodded without question, stepping onto the same worn boards that lined the street, until he reached the center of the square where everything seemed to converge. And he stopped there, not because anyone had called him, but because he knew this was where it would happen. And for a moment, nothing changed. The town continued its quiet rhythm, voices rising and falling, footsteps passing, until one by one, people began to notice, not what he was doing, but the fact that he was not leaving. And that alone was enough to slow things down, to shift the air in a way that could not be ignored. And across the street, Daniel Whitmore stepped into view, his gaze finding Elias without hesitation, as if he had been expecting this, as if the path he had been following had finally reached its end. And not far behind, Clara Whitmore stood, near the edge of the gathering, her posture straight, her face composed, but her eyes fixed on Elias with an intensity that did not belong to the moment, but to everything that had led to it. And as the town began to gather without being asked, drawn by something they could not name, but could not ignore, Elias Carter stood in the center of it all and understood that this was no longer about what had happened by the creek. It was about what had been allowed to remain hidden ever since. And as the first voice broke the silence, asking what this was about, Elias did not look away, did not hesitate, because the decision had already been made long before he took that first step into town. And now, with every eye on him and every expectation hanging in the air, he prepared to do the one thing he had avoided for 5 years, not because he no longer feared the consequences, but because he finally understood that some truths do not destroy a man when they are spoken, they destroy him when they are not. The first words did not come easily, not because Elias Carter did not know what to say, but because he understood that once spoken, they would not belong to him anymore. They would belong to everyone standing there, to the town, to the man waiting across from him, to the woman who had carried the same silence in a different way. And so he stood for a moment longer, letting the weight of that settle, letting the quiet stretch just enough that people began to lean forward without realizing it. And then he spoke, his voice steady, not loud, but clear in a way that did not ask to be heard. It simply was. And he said that 5 years ago, during the storm that most of them remembered only as a night of heavy rain and flooded roads, something else had happened out by the creek, something that had not been part of the story they had told themselves since then. And the crowd shifted slightly, not in fear, but in attention, because people recognize when something real is about to be said, even if they do not yet know what it is. And Elias did not rush. He did not fill the space with unnecessary detail. He let each word settle before moving to the next, describing the storm, the rising water, the way the land had seemed to disappear under the weight of it. And then he spoke of being there, of seeing someone else there as well. And though he did not say her name yet, there were those in the crowd whose eyes had already moved toward Clara Whitmore, as if some part of them had been waiting for this connection without ever admitting it. And Daniel Whitmore did not move, did not interrupt, but there was a stillness in him now that had not been there before. The stillness of a man who knows he is about to hear something that will not leave him unchanged. And Elias continued, saying that what he saw that night was not what the town might assume, that it was not something simple or easy to judge from a distance. And his words carried no defense, no accusation, only a quiet insistence that the truth did not belong to rumor or assumption. And for a moment, it seemed as though the town itself held its breath, the usual sounds fading into something distant, something unimportant compared to what was unfolding in front of them. And Clara stood where she was, her expression unchanged, her gaze fixed on Elias not with fear, but with something closer to acceptance, as if she had known this moment would come long before anyone else. And when Elias finally spoke her name, not loudly, not dramatically, just as a fact placed carefully into the open, it moved through the crowd like a ripple that no one could stop. And still he did not rush. He did not turn this into spectacle. He simply continued, guiding them toward the part of the story that mattered, the part that explained not just what had happened, but why it had been carried in silence for so long. And as he spoke, it became clear that this was not a confession in the way people expected. It was something else, something quieter and heavier. The kind of truth that does not demand reaction, but changes the ground beneath those who hear it. And by the time he paused, the town was no longer waiting for him to speak. It was waiting to understand what it had just begun to hear. What Elias Carter said next did not come with raised voice or sharpened tone. It came the same way everything else had, steady, deliberate, carrying weight not through force but through certainty. And he told them that the man who had come through Red Hollow 5 years ago had not been what he claimed to be, that he had not been just another traveler passing through with no ties and no purpose, but someone who had left a trail behind him that no one in this town had ever bothered to follow. And there was a shift in the crowd then, subtle, but real, because people began to understand that this was not just about what had happened. It was about what had been missed, what had been ignored because it was easier that way. And Elias did not accuse the town, did not turn his words into blame. He simply continued, explaining that on the night of the storm, what he had seen was not an act that needed judgment from those who were not there, but a moment that had already carried its own consequence, a moment where a choice had been made, not out of anger or gain, but out of something far simpler and harder to argue against, the need to survive what stood in front of you when walking away was no longer an option. And though he never described more than that, though he never used words that would turn the moment into something harsh or graphic, the meaning settled into the space between them all the same, clear enough that no one needed to ask for more. And Daniel Whitmore stood there listening, his posture unchanged, but the certainty that had once defined him no longer as sharp as it had been, because what he was hearing did not match the shape of the story he had carried with him for so long. And Elias turned his gaze toward him then, not challenging, not defensive, just meeting him where he stood, and he said that there were things a man could spend years searching for only to find that the answer did not bring him what he expected, that sometimes the truth did not offer closure, it offered understanding, and understanding asked more of a person than anger ever could. And for a moment, it seemed as though the entire town existed in that pause, caught between what they had believed and what they were now being asked to accept. And Clara Whitmore remained where she was, her expression calm. But there was something different now, something lighter in the way she held herself, not because the burden had been lifted, but because it had finally been shared. And as Elias finished speaking, he did not look around for approval, did not wait for reaction, because he understood that what mattered had already been said, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of people rethinking what they thought they knew, full of a man standing with a truth he had carried too long, and full of another man realizing that the answer he had come for was not something he could take back with him unchanged. No one moved right away, and that was what made it real, not the words that had been spoken, but the stillness that followed them, the kind that settles over a place when something deeper than opinion has just taken hold. And Elias Carter stood where he was, not waiting, not expecting anything in return, because he understood that what came next did not belong to him anymore. It belonged to those who had heard and now had to decide what to do with it. And Daniel Whitmore remained across from him, his gaze lowered slightly, not in defeat, but in thought, the kind that does not rush to conclusions because it knows the cost of getting them wrong. And for a long moment, the man who had come to Red Hollow searching for answers did not speak. And when he finally did, his voice was quieter than before, stripped of the edge it had carried when he first arrived. And he said that he had spent years believing he knew who his brother was, what kind of man he had been, and what had been taken from him. But that belief had been built on absence, on not knowing. And now, standing here, hearing what had been kept hidden, he was no longer certain that the man he had been searching for was the man he thought he had lost. And the words did not bring resolution. They brought something else, something more difficult, the understanding that truth does not always return things to where they belong. Sometimes it simply changes what belonging means, and the town listened, not with the restless energy it had carried before, but with a quiet attention that came from realizing they were no longer watching a moment unfold. They were part of it, and the sheriff, who had spent his years believing in the clarity of right and wrong, stood with his hands resting loosely at his sides, his usual certainty replaced by something less defined, because there was nothing here he could enforce, nothing he could resolve with rules or authority. And Clara Whitmore stepped forward then, not quickly, not dramatically, just a few measured steps that brought her into the same space Elias had occupied alone moments before. And she did not look at the crowd. She did not address the town. She looked only at Daniel, her expression steady, and for the first time, there was something in her voice when she spoke that had not been there before, Not fear, not regret, but openness. The kind that comes when there is nothing left to protect. And she said that she had never expected forgiveness. That she had never asked for it. Because what had happened that night was not something that could be undone or explained in a way that made it easier. But it was something she had lived with every day since. Not as a burden she wished to escape, but as a truth she had accepted. And Daniel listened, not interrupting, not challenging, just taking in the words the same way he had taken in everything else. And when she finished, there was no demand for judgment, no plea for understanding, just silence again. But this time it was different. This time it did not feel like something waiting to be broken. It felt like something settling into place, and Elias Carter, standing just off to the side now, realized that what had begun as a secret carried between two people had become something larger, something that no longer needed to be hidden because it had found its place in the open, not as a story the town would repeat, but as a truth it would carry quietly, the way all real things are. Carried out here, without noise, without spectacle, and without the need to be spoken again. The town did not return to what it had been, not exactly. And that was the quiet truth no one spoke out loud as the gathering slowly began to dissolve, people stepping back into their routines with a kind of measured calm, as if they understood that something had shifted but did not need to be named for it to be real. And Daniel Whitmore remained where he stood for a moment longer, his gaze lifting from the ground to meet Clara one last time, not with accusation, not with forgiveness, but with something more honest than either, an acceptance that the story he had carried no longer fit the world as it was. And without another word, he gave a small nod, the kind that closes a chapter without ceremony, and turned away, walking toward the edge of town with the same steady pace he had arrived with, but carrying less certainty and more understanding than before. And Clara Whitmore watched him go, her expression unchanged, but there was a stillness in her now that felt different, not the stillness of holding something in, but the stillness of having nothing left to hide. And when she finally turned, her eyes found Elias Carter. And for a brief moment, the space between them held everything that had passed, the years of silence, the weight of it, and the release that had come with letting it go. And she did not thank him, did not speak at all, because some things, once done, do not need to be acknowledged to be understood. And Elias gave the slightest incline of his head in return, not as agreement, not as closure, but as recognition. And then he stepped back, out of the center of the square, out of the place where everything had unfolded, returning to the edge where he had always belonged. And the town moved around him again, the same as before, but not quite the same. The conversations quieter, the judgments softer, as if everyone had learned something they would not repeat, but would not forget either. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the worn boards and dusty ground, Elias walked away from the square without looking back, his pace unhurried, his posture unchanged, but something within him no longer carrying the weight it once had, because the silence he had held for 5 years was no longer his to keep. And as he reached the edge of town where the open land began again, he paused for just a moment, looking out over the wide stretch of earth that asked nothing and offered no answers. And in that quiet, he understood something simple, something that had taken years to come clear, that out here, justice does not always arrive with noise or force. It arrives in the moment a man chooses to stand still and speak, when it would be easier to remain silent. And then, without another thought, Elias Carter stepped forward into the fading light, leaving behind a town that would remember not what was said, but the way it had been said, and the kind of man it had taken to say it. In this deeply emotional journey of Western stories, a quiet rancher carries a secret that reshapes an entire town, while a composed woman lives with a truth no one dares to question. When a determined stranger arrives searching for answers about his missing brother, the fragile balance of silence begins to fracture, revealing how choices made in the shadows can echo across years, set against the vast and unforgiving American frontier. This cinematic tale of Western stories explores honor, restraint, and the unseen weight of moral decisions, where a lone rancher must decide whether silence is protection or betrayal, and where a strong woman stands at the center of a truth that refuses to stay buried. As tension rises and the town is forced to confront what it has ignored, this powerful entry among Western stories delivers a slow-burning narrative filled with atmosphere, human depth, and quiet confrontation, showing how justice in the Old West does not always arrive with violence, but with the courage to finally speak. Through restrained dialogue, rich sensory storytelling, and emotionally grounded character arcs, this story embodies the essence of Western stories, where dignity outweighs judgment and understanding replaces vengeance. In the end, this unforgettable piece of Western stories reminds us that sometimes the strongest act a person can take is not drawing a weapon, but standing still long enough to tell the truth.